read where those promises come with stipulations. Anybody have anything they would like to add to that section? If not, somebody please read verses 3 and 4.
And Abraham rose up from before his death and said to the Hittites, I am a sojourner and foreigner among you. Give me the property among you for a burying place, that I may bury my dead out of my sight.
So, Heth is probably a small colony of the Hittites, which is a name that we continue to hear further into the Bible. It's interesting here that Abraham acknowledges himself as a stranger and a sojourner. So we know that through this, he's traveled through a lot of areas. And part of the reason that travel is God's promise that I will give you the land where your feet rest. So as he's traveling around, he's seeing all those things. He's traveling this land, he's seeing it. He's still a sojourner, so they haven't taken the property of the land yet. So he's still recognizing the individuals that actually physically possess the land. And so really, also the other thing about this is Abraham is really the first time that he's been concerned with having a physical piece of property to own. So far, everything else that he's done, everything else moves with him. His wealth is in land or is in cattle, sheep, oxen, the animals that have to move around anyway to make sure they have enough land to actually graze on. But he's never been concerned with having a piece of property or something to call his own. The only permanent structures that we really read of him building are the altars. And that was in Genesis 12, 7 and 8, 13, verses 4 and verses 18. And those structures were apparently pretty permanent because he built one, he moved, and he actually moved back to it, came back to it a while later, and it was still sitting there. But those were, I guess, relatively movable because he just built what he needed when he got there, but they didn't get picked up and moved with him. That was about the only thing he owned that couldn't be picked up and moved. But ever since we actually start reading of Abraham at the end of chapter 11, in 12 verses 10, he passed through Canaan, and due to the famine, he sojourned to Egypt. In 15:13, he actually dwelt in the land of the Ammonites. Genesis 18, he's in the plains of Mamre, which is where we're going to see him going back to. And in Genesis 20, he sojourned in Gerar, the land of the Philistines or King Abimelech. And he was permitted to dwell wherever he pleased, but he was allowed to stay there. It really never became his land. So I kind of thought that was interesting. This is the first time we really read anything about the permanency, the lack of permanency actually being an issue for him. Yes?
What does that phrase, that I may bury my dead out of my sight, I mean, is that, do you know what kind of seems odd that he would say that?
Didn't they put them in sepulchres or in caves or whatever?
We're going to find out he buys a cave in order to put her in, and then we find out later that even, I think Caleb or Joshua, Abraham and Isaac, I think, are all buried in that same land. Do you have any?
When we say something, when we say that, like out of my sight, we don't ever want to see them again, you know what I mean? So I just didn't know, it kind of seems like if we were saying, you know, like, bury around us, you know, I don't ever want to.
Well, because I know, and Cody, correct me if I misspeak here, that they don't get the rules on handling the dead until the Israelites come into play and they're traveling in the wilderness, because they were required to stay. They had to go through the purification process for, I think, 7 days for when they had to bury one of their dead. The other piece of it, I would think, is without having, this is just me speaking now, is the preservation that if a body didn't really, I mean, I know the Egyptians, you go back pretty good ways, but you know, he's traveling around. They probably don't have the preservation capabilities that even we do today or the Egyptians practiced. So the decay is probably going to set in very, very quick. And for someone, you know, we read about how he wept. He doesn't want to see her in that decayed state. And so they stick him in the cave, allow him to go through that process, and then, you know, run through that. Like I said, that's just me speaking. I don't know Doyle?
I was gonna say one other thing, it may not be, as it's translated and as we have it, it may not be that meaning as much as it is, let me do something with my dead, otherwise I still have them.
Right.
You know, let me have a place to put them.
I need to recognize my rituals or processes or,
Well,
So that-
yeah.
Like you said,
Or you don't have a place,
any land.
you don't have any place to put them at all.
right.
I wanna put them somewhere.
And as that process happens, a tent's not gonna contain that
That's correct, yeah.
process very well, so I can imagine that'd be pretty important. The other piece I thought was interesting is Abraham, we know, has a very large troop that follows him around. He's got a very good sized servants, and his family's not large, but the servants that come with him, and they're loyal to him. They go fight for him as soon as he said, "Oh, let's go." They go off and march against 5 kings without a hesitation. This isn't the first person he's had to bury during this process. So I'm curious we don't read about it, but I'm just curious what the process has been so far. You know, what do they do with them? Do they bury them? Do they have caves? Do they just, don't have a clue answer for it, but it's just an interesting thought that the importance of this one, that it's actually being called out, is interesting. Anybody have anything else? I appreciate the comments. Start, read 5 through 11, please.
The children of Heth answered Abraham, saying unto him, Hear us, my Lord, thou art a mighty prince among us. In the choice of our sepulchres buried thy dead, none of us shall withhold from thee his sepulchre, but that thou mayest bury thy dead. And Abraham stood up and bowed himself to the people of the land, even to the children of Heth. And he communed with them, saying, If it be your mind that I should bury my dead out of my sight, hear me, and entreat for me to Ephron the son of Copeland, that he may give me the cave of Machpelah, which he hath, which is in the end of his field. For as much money as it is worth, he shall give it me for a possession of a burying place amongst you. And Ephron dwelt among the children of Heth. And Ephron the Hittite answered Abraham in the audience of the children of Heth, even of all that went in at the gate of his city, saying, Nay, my Lord, hear me. The field give I thee, the cave that is therein I give it thee. In the presence of the sons of my people give I it thee. Bury thy dead.
Thank you. So where are they at this time? Where does Abraham meet the people of the city? Well, he was meeting with them, and there's a physical location that they go meet at, where it, as part of the city. So they're at the gates of the city. So what we see is they don't have our record keeping like we do today. They don't, if we have a deed or exchange hands or something along those lines, you go to the lawyer, you follow the city or the state or whoever the governing jurisdiction is. That doesn't exist at this time. So he's meeting them at the gates of the city, where there's witnesses, the elders, and we actually read about this a number of times. If somebody please jump over into Ruth chapter 4 and read verse 11 real quick. The section actually covers 1 through 12, but Ruth chapter 4 verse 11, we kind of see that the history continues on.
And all the people that were in the gate and the elders said, We are witnesses. The Lord make the woman that is come into thine house like Rachel, and like Leah, which two did build the house of Israel, and do thou worthily in Ephrathah, and be famous in Bethlehem.
So up through 1 through 10, Boaz wants to marry Ruth, but there's a relationship that's closer to her, so he has to go and make that deal. And so they go meet at the gate, meet with the elders, and they make their negotiations, they make their deal there. So this habit, even as we progress and cultures change, and they're in a permanent land at this point, it doesn't change. That same process of meeting with the elders is still there. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Even as far back as here, that tradition hasn't really changed as we go through the future. The other piece of it I thought was interesting here is Abraham is in grief. Him and his wife have pretty much been able to rely on each other for the last 25, 30 years plus, and she's passed. We know in verse 1 that it states that she weeps. but he still meets the individuals at the cave with purpose. He knows which piece of land he wants. He knows the cave that he wants to put her in, and he knows who owns it. So even in that grief, he has enough respect, enough forethought in it to have all that items prepared. So it's a purposeful decision. He didn't go there and go try to figure out who was going to get the cave. You know, he had a location that he wanted to put Sarah in for this purpose.
Well, what about, I read that, I was thinking he didn't want them to just give him the land. He wanted to buy it, and that way if they could, later on, if they said anything, he could show that he had bought it.
Right, and we're going to get into that in the next section. That he won't allow it to be a gift.
Right.
So
He kept saying, what I was thinking he was trying to do, because they said, oh, go ahead and take it, yeah, because you're such a good man.
right,
But he was going, in case further down the road, they come back and say, hey, he could say, no, I bought this, or.
well, his son comes in and goes,
Yeah.
oh, that was just for that purpose. It really still belongs to me.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's a brokered deal that he wants to make at this point, and witnesses. Because I would say, in agreement with what you're saying, if it was just, hey, I need a cave, go to that individual. Can I stick them here for the next couple of years, and then
Yeah.
you know it's still yours? But he obviously went there with an intent and purpose. Anybody have anything else? Let's read 12 through 15.
And Abraham bowed down himself before the people of the land. And he spake unto Ephron in the audience of the people of the land, saying, But if thou wilt give it, I pray thee, hear me. I will give thee money for the field. Take it of me, and I will bury my dead there. And Ephron answered Abraham, saying unto him, My Lord, hearken unto me. The land is worth 400 shekels of silver. What is that betwixt me and thee? Bury therefore thy dead.
Appreciate it. So this is where we get back into the comment where Ephraim is more concerned with his relationship with Abraham than he is with the price of the land. Take it. He doesn't want the money for it originally. The 400 shekels of silver is, you know, what is that? It's nothing in comparison to the relationship that we have. This is where I have some competing information. The notes that I have here was provided by Moffat it's about $5,000 with inflation. I've seen on another source, it was about $100,000. So there's a little bit of a discrepancy between what that shekel's weight of silver was, but I wouldn't think that 5,000 is nothing to me. So even if that number is correct, that's still a large sum of money. And the relationship that Abraham and Ephraim have apparently at this point, that's even that amount of money is considered, it's water under the bridge. Let's just do this, and you know, it's yours. Take it. Do what you need to do. So that shows a tremendous amount of respect that individuals have for Abraham at this point. The other interesting piece is there's a price that's being stated here without ever even being, hey, this is what I want for it. This is what it's worth. So you basically have started a price at that point, even without the intent of actually selling the land. So it's kind of an interesting way to state it. So this kind of concept, and this may be kind of what made me think of, was if y'all shift over to 2 Samuel 24, 18 through 25. And the verse I'm real concerned with is verse 24, but if I get somebody to read 18 through 2 Samuel chapter 24, verses 18 through 25.
And Gad came that day to David and said unto him, Go up, rear an altar unto the Lord on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. And David, according to the saying of Gad, went up as the Lord commanded. And Araunah looked and saw the king and his servants coming on towards him. And Araunah went out and bowed himself before the king on his face upon the ground. And Araunah said, Wherefore is my lord the king come to his servant? And David sent to buy the threshing floor of thee, to build an altar unto the Lord, that the plague may be stayed from the people. And Araunah said unto David, Let my lord the king take and offer up what seemeth good unto him. Behold, here be oxen for burnt sacrifice, and threshing instruments, and other instruments of the oxen for wood. All these things did Araunah, as a king, give unto the king. And Araunah said unto the king, The Lord thy God accept thee. And the king said unto Araunah, Nay, but I will surely buy it of thee at a price. Neither will I offer burnt offerings unto the Lord my God of that which doth cost me nothing. So David bought the threshing floor and the oxen for 50 shekels of silver. And David built there an altar unto the Lord, and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. So the Lord was entreated for the land, and the plague was stayed from Israel.
So the verse I wanted to concentrate in there, where David talks to Araunah, I will buy thee at a price. I will not offer anything to my Lord which has cost me nothing. So he bought the threshing floor and the oxen. So I kind of relate what Abraham's situation now is right now with Sarah, that he recognizes that the land is his at no cost. And I still contend that all that land there is actually Abraham's anyway, because God said it will be yours. And we actually can read where God said he has given it to him already. So it's interesting to me, he's actually going through respecting the individuals there and buying land that he technically owns, because God said he does. But it's important enough to him in the respect that he's showing to Sarah that he is going through the effort and wants to purchase the land. He's willing to part with silver at this point in order to own that land, to be able to respect and honor her correctly. And we do find out that later on that it does come back and multiple individuals of his generation are buried there. So, anybody have anything they'd like to add? So, let's read 16 through 20. It'll take us to the end of the chapter.
Abraham listened to Ephron, and Abraham weighed out for Ephron the silver that he had named in the hearing of the Hittites, 400 shekels of silver, according to the weights current among the merchants. So the field of Ephron in Machpelah was, which was to the east of Mamre, the field with the cave that was in it, and all the trees were in the field throughout its whole area, was made over to Abraham, a possession in the presence of the Hittites before all who went into the gate of his city. After this, Abraham buried Sarah his wife in the cave of the field of Machpelah, east of Mamre, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. The field and the cave that is in it were made over to Abraham as property for a burying place by the Hittites.
Thank you. So just one of the notes that he places, we do find out there's multiple individuals buried in this cave. Those buried in Hebron. We'll find out here in a few chapters in Genesis 25:9 that Abraham will be buried in Hebron. Isaac will be buried there in chapter 35. Rebekah and Leah are both going to be laid there in chapter 49. And then finally Jacob will actually be placed in there in chapter 50. So this cave serves multiple generations as we go down through. Anybody remember how much silver Abimelech gave to Abraham as part of the settling of the dispute between, or I should say the deceit between Abraham and Sarah, as they basically lied to Abimelech? I remember what he was given as part of that reconciliation process. Yeah, 1,000 pieces. One of the notes I saw was the pieces is kind of a misnomer because they didn't have actual currency. So it's all like it's stated here. Abraham weighed to Ephron the silver, so it's a weight, not necessarily a count. They didn't have punched 30 pieces of silver. So he's given 1,000 shekels from Abimelech to Abraham And now, I just thought that was interesting. Now it's costing $400 shekels to bury her. So if Abimelech was still alive, because it was a number of years before, I'm curious to see what he would have had to, what his thoughts would have been. That, yeah, I'm buying this land, basically through the deceit of Abraham. So the amount was probably relatively insignificant to Abraham because of the amount of wealth he had. But I just thought that was interesting. Those amounts were called out in the Bible. Jeff?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, you made a comparison with Abraham buying the tomb, David buying the area for sacrifice and the materials for sacrifice. Looking at the depths of the things that you do for what you love. Abraham, it just kind of struck me. He gave silver according to what the merchant scales were already at, which is strange because what would typically take place in the marketplace is they would test the scales to see whether or not they're being ripped off.
Okay.
But Abraham doesn't care about that at all. He's trying to give honor to who honor is due. And I think that, and you see the same thing with David. He didn't care about what the scale said. He said, if that's 50, that's 50. I don't care. When you think about giving honor to God, giving honor to the ones you love, it's very likely you're going to be gypped in one way or another. Not gypped by God, but you could be gypped by others in your service to God. You see that with, you go door knocking, right? You're spending the effort. And, materials you door knock, they cost money. The materials you use to advertise the church cost money. And you have few results. And at the end of the day, it's not about what it costs. It's not about what it costs you personally. It's about what you're doing. You're honoring who you love. And you demonstrate that, I'm not going to say by being carefree, but by acknowledging your service above your cost.
We're not looking at it from a company's marketing standpoint where how much money did that ad bring me in.
Right.
One lost soul is worth whatever expense that you're willing to, that you can place into it, whether it's time or money or that kind of effort.
Right.
Because we even see that with with David lining up, setting up, buying the materials, getting everything ready for the temple. Even as we go in later on with the temple being restored, the money going in there, we can read where the people of Israel, it was even more than the temple could support.
You get little snippets of Jesus' ministry where he's taking care of people. We know that he had a money bag, right? Because it tells us Judas stole from the money bag.
Right.
How often do we think that Jesus was actually concerned with what was in the money bag and what he had to himself? And there's so many small snippets where Jesus is giving freely and Jesus is giving to a people that he ultimately knows are hard-hearted, and all he's trying to do is soften their heart. Now that's not a reason to just pour everything aside and begin to be carefree, but it is something to pick up on and not be stingy about.
Because even, I'm trying to think, the only time I can remember them actually putting money out of the money bag was to pay taxes, and he was told to go catch a fish, and that's where the money was found.
Yeah.
So it didn't even come out of the money bag at that point.
Yeah.
So the money was, it's almost an insignificant conversation piece at that point. So you might have gotten into this, and I may be off on my land locations. So Hebron, and we find that in verse 19 that we have the field of Machpelah before Mamre. And anybody remember the importance of that location? Or where we've read about it before?
Is that where the land was divided?
Abraham.
Went to Mamre, Lot went to Sodom and Gomorrah.
Right. And who was he dwelling with during that time? What people? I can't remember the names, but I remember So he was dwelling in Mamre, and there was 3 brothers that he was dwelling with that were from a different people, and they actually went to war with them. Read where they went to war with him when he went against to retrieve Lot and his and peoples from Sodom. They were the brothers. They were from the Ammonites. So, and I don't know if there's a break in the property there. We do know that Abraham's picked up and moved from Mamre to a couple different locations and now dwell in the Philistines. But I'm curious at this point if if that land location has changed from the Ammonites to the Philistines, the Hittites, the Abimelech. I don't know if they've gone in and conquered that area yet or not. But it seems like if they did, Abraham would have gotten out of that area, sojourned to another location. That attack or that battle or however the property changed hands would have occurred, and then Abraham circling back around to that area now. So.
He would, well, I think, the preacher, if humor means commune, and, memory means vision, so maybe he went back. I don't know. Commune before Abraham.
Right, commune with God there. Most of what we read was his communing with God. That's where he fed God and the angels before they went to Sodom. That's where the promise with him, I believe, was originally made, was even in the Hebron area. But I don't know if, like I said, I'm not sure if the land has it's changed hands at this point, if there has been something we don't get to read about, where the Ammonites have been removed from that area, and now the children of Heth or the Hittites now control it. But it appears to me that something has changed hands enough in the history of here that somebody else controls the land that he was originally staying in with those brothers. One thing I thought was interesting also is I typically read out of the King James Version. In the end of verse 17, and I believe it was listed one other time in there, is the statement that the borders round about were made sure. Get into the strong stuff that the nice thing on the apps and the phones and the tablets give you is you can kind of change that translation into a deed was established. So it appears they went out and said from this point to this point, basically drew blinds around it on the map where what was all included in that property. So I thought that was kind of curious why it was said it was made sure, but it was just kind of basically what we consider a modern day deed was lines were drawn. So that gets us through chapter 23. Does anybody have anything else they'd like to add to that? Got about 5 more minutes.
Yeah, you can continue recalling.
Well, I was going to start. I don't have the information necessarily prepared. I apologize. When you put it down on paper, it seems like it's going to take a lot longer than what it does when you start talking. Plus, I talk a lot faster than I type, I guess, so it doesn't help any. If y'all will, until the bell rings, I'm going to suggest start reading through chapter 24 to give us a little bit of a head start on that one. Like I said, if you look at it, it's almost 70 verses. So I know when Chris gets back next week, it's probably going to take multiple weeks. Doyle?
Since you have time, the Hittites and Heth, I have a note here that those are the descendants of Ham. Is that correct?
Sounds correct.
We can fact check.
Just as we're looking through, this again goes back to you have a lot of different people listed here, but we're still coming from, I guess, just the one, or those that were on the ark.
Yeah, I know whenever there was a note in here that I think when Abraham started his journey, there's only about 30,000 people at that point. That's all the population had grown back up to in that time frame. If I can remember the notes that were provided correctly, and how he got to that math, I can't promise, but that's where his estimate came in. And I know that from what Chris was saying, tradition states that, or Jewish tradition has Melchizedek, I'm not sure how you actually properly pronounce it, is potentially Shem, because he's still alive at this point. He actually dies just before Isaac does, I believe. So he's still alive at this point. So the generations go back, and you would think that you'd still have brothers. You'd still know each other. Hey, that's so many cousins down the line. Looking in chapter 10.
It would be, verse 15, Cain fathered Sidon, his firstborn from Heth. Heth is the father of the Hittites.
Okay. And even getting there, the Jebusites, which you read about with David, who he bought the threshing floor from. Border of Canaanites from Sidon as they come as to Gerar and Gaza. So even read about that area. Looks like the sons of Ham were the ones that controlled most of that area based off chapter 10. And Abraham was which son? Shem? Because that was the son of promise. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Genesis 11:26.
So not only would Shem have been the patriarch, it would have been Noah or Abraham's two-generation great-grandfather. So, and Ham's the one that sinned against Noah. Am I getting my names correct? That's what happens when I go off memory. It gets dangerous off here quick.
Ham's the youngest.
So we still see where those choices of that generational choice still seems to follow some of that down the line, because as the Israelites come from Shem and Ham's the one that sinned against Noah, that's where that strife never seems to end as they go through the process.
It was Ham that looked upon Noah. It's interesting because Ham's father the Canaanites. In verse 25, Genesis 9:25 says, "Cursed be Canaan. A servant of servants shall be to his people, to his brothers." And then you see Moses or Abraham here in the land of Canaan. What are they doing? Serving.
He's the smaller guy, but they still bow down to him. They still look at him for dwell where you want to dwell. Our caves are yours. It's not the other way around, where you think that an individual that moves around doesn't have much of a choice. And even with Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham has to go rescue them. They can't do it on their own. And you'd have to think between four cities you had more than 400 people to go to war with. Even if the population size then is still only 30,000 people.
Even zeros and more in Genesis 9:26. Blessed be the God of the Lord, the God of Shem, Abraham's direct descendant to Noah, and let Canaan, again, that would be the Hittites, be his servant. Here they are.
And we know that entire area is eventually supposed to be wiped out. You know, they become servants where they shouldn't be, because that's not the command, but they do continue that tradition. It's interesting how that, regardless of how many generations it is, regardless of how long it takes, God's plan still comes to fruition. We still see that being succeeded in the process. And I think the even bigger interesting point of it is when the Israelites come through, yes, God allows them to conquer it, and it's basically by force of the sword. But with Abraham, they see his blessings, they respect him as an individual, and that's where the service comes from, is those blessings. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a war to get God's promises succeeded in the process. Appreciate that. I didn't think about going that far back in the process.